Hey. Welcome to Principles of Ecology, a course being taught via YouTube lectures asynchronously, as well as in Zoom person at LSU. It's an upper level undergraduate course on ecology. And so today we'll be talking about, in a very general sense, what ecology is. And so I'm going to move this over to this screen, and I'm going to share the screen that has the notes on it. All right. And so these are the notes for today. You will be reading for this week. You'll be reading 2 articles. The first is a sort of paper, and I'll fix that link. I think it's might be broken. You can check that really fast. Open another window. It is broken, but I'll fix that and email it out. Sorry about that. Or you can just Google this, and it should come up with the right link. We'll be reading scientific papers at least a few weeks in class, and so thinking about how to do so is really important, because how you read a scientific article is very different than how you read a textbook or a piece of fiction. And it's really a skill that you have to sort of learn. Otherwise, you'll just end up reading and rereading the same text without actually sort of understanding the main points. The second reading is from the Ecological Society of America, which is the sort of preeminent ecology group here in the US. And it's entitled, "What does ecology have to do with me?" And so that'll start to get you thinking about the different levels of biological organization and how they can serve mankind. I'm just kidding. That's not the point of ecology, but it does help ground a lot of concepts in as they relate to human populations. I think ecology is awesome just because it's fun, right? Like, I think it's intrinsically of value and of interest. But whatever, I think they do a good job explaining it too. I'm going to try to use the virtual whiteboard if I can here in conjunction with my notes and just me talking. I'm very used to walking around the room and having the dry erase board and using that, or using the overhead sort of projector thing, document camera. It's like the new overhead projector. So this is going to be a challenge, but it'll be good. Any notes that I make, any scribbles, I'll try to distribute afterwards if they make any sense, and if I'm able to actually do it. So we defined this earlier. We defined ecology in this, when we went over the syllabus, as the study of species interactions. And species interactions is like a huge nebulous type of thing, right? And so I alluded to it earlier. So now I'm switching screens. Hopefully you can see that, over to this virtual whiteboard thing. And I want to just write out things like a species. That's too much. I'm just going to write triangle. That's a species, by the way. Since we have a black triangle, and then we have red circle. And so let's say these are species. Species interactions could be viewed as just the interaction between the two. It's competition or it's predation. And so they either compete for a limiting resource, which is down here. It's this sweet plant that I'm drawing. It looks like a plant, right? I'm doing it with a mouse, not a stylus. You're not giving me some slack. And so there could be a relationship here where this one, with the width of the line indicating like the strength of the interaction. So this triangle eats this odd grass-like thing with like a lot. It just has a really big effect on it, whereas this red circle eats it, but doesn't really eat it that much. And so here we already have a bunch of different types of interactions. Here we have a competitive interaction. Here we have a predatory interaction, a consumer resource interaction, as we'll call them. But there's more than just like sort of species interactions. And so if we, hopefully people can see yellow. It looks pretty clear on my screen, but hopefully it is clear on yours as well. I'm drawing a circle around this. And so this is sort of, these are species interactions. This is species interacting with other species. But that's not sort of like all of ecology, obviously. And sort of you can have cases where species don't just interact with species, but species also interact with things like their environment. And so, oh my gosh, I am drawing a dinosaur in the sky. This is what I think the sun looks like. So the species interact with their environments in terms of things like thermal radiation, so or solar radiation. And so this plant interacts with its environment, and specifically the availability of sunlight, which can be viewed to some extent as a consumer resource interaction, but not really. And so, so we looked at sort of species to species, species to environment, janky, but I got there. So these are the sort of two interactions: an interaction between species and other species via predation, mutualism, just competition, or with species and their environment. Oops, there we go. So here I define the different types of, oh, that's not true. Okay, so this is a point that I sort of failed to mention at first, is species also sort of interact with themselves. And so here we defined competition interspecifically. So let's see if I can add that in. Interspecific. Means between species. So I make that bigger, and then I'll move it. Whoop. Move it down here, and I'll also make the text a little bit smaller. I don't know how to do that. Oh, there it is. Okay, so interspecific means between species. Intraspecific means within the same species. And so when we think about species interactions and competition, we could have the triangle and the circle, two different species interacting. That would be interspecific. We could also have individuals of this species, of the triangle. Draw them over here. Interacting with one another via competition, via mutualism, via something. And that would also be, an intraspecific interaction. And so the interactions that we'll focus on first are those within a single population, species are interacting. Another thing that I sort of mentioned on the lecture slides were the sort of four main types of species interactions in a term of symbioses. And so symbiosis, it just directly translates, I think, from Greek as meaning to live together or to live as one. Sim meaning together, bios meaning to live. And so these come in at least 4 flavors, and that's Amensalism, Commensalism. Did I spell that wrong? I think I probably did. Oh yeah, way off. Not even close. Actually, kind of close. Or better off, whatever. I think that's right. If it's not, they're going to take away my ecology license. Parasitism. Unless do they count parasitism? No, yeah, and mutualism. All right. And so these differ in terms of how the interaction manifests itself. And here's what I mean by that. So let's start with, we'll go bottom up. Actually, yeah, let's go bottom up. And so we can start, they don't give me that many colors to work with. That sort of bothers me. We got blue though. All right. So we have these two species, the triangle and the circle species. If they're in a mutualistic interaction, it means that they benefit, they both benefit. So and by benefit, I mean they get something out of it in terms of, I guess you could define it as overall fitness. Fitness being the sort of ability of you to pass on and increase your population or your individual growth rate. So your ability to acquire resources will affect fitness. But regardless, mutualism is, it somehow improves the situation. Both species get something out of it. So if we think about what that would look like, it would be a plus on this side and a plus on this side. And so mutualism, let's consider these plus interactions, if that looks like a plus. And let's move that. All right, and redraw the pluses. Parasitism. And so this kind of like if a helminth parasite, which is like a worm, infects a host's individual's intestines, they're extracting host resources and they're getting a benefit, but the host is actually getting a cost to the parasitism. And so this is a situation, so if this red circle is a parasite, it's receiving a benefit and its host is actually receiving a cost, a fitness cost or a negative effect. I'll try not to use fitness so loosely, because I think some people might get mad at me for saying fitness. And so just think of it in terms of cost. In terms of, I don't know, reproduction or survival. And so there, and the cost can be in terms of survival. So an individual can be so parasitized that it dies, or it could not be able to reproduce since it's too heavily parasitized and has that cost, but needs to go out and forage instead of reproducing. Or it's actively selected, or it's actively selected against because it's too parasitized, and you can see it in the condition of the organism. And so nobody would mate with this incredibly parasitized individual because of the potential success and the reduced survival of the future offspring. That ties it back into fitness a bit. And the last two are commensalism and amensalism. I'm trying to see if I actually go over this. No, I don't. I think I might go over this in like a second lecture, but that's neither here nor there. And so commensalism, I should, what am I doing? What the fuck is commensalism? I think, so amensalism is when nobody does anything. No, that's not right. So commensalism is when one species benefits from the interaction and the other species doesn't care. So let's say that circle, the previous one was a parasite of triangle, is sort of a quote unquote parasite in that it, let's say it eats the host's dead skin cells. It just hangs out on its back and is just eating the dead skin cells of the host. It's receiving a benefit, the circle is, so let's give that a plus, a really bad plus. But it's not affecting the triangle. So it's just like, all right, that's fine. That's commensalism. Amensalism is basically the sort of opposite of the other side of that coin, where one species is having a negative effect on the other, while that species just doesn't have any effect on it. And so an example of this would be if you had a plant that moved into an area and shed all of its leaves. So like a pine, their needles are very acidic, and they can actually change the pH of the soil around them. So that could benefit them, but it actually will harm, or it could either benefit or just like do nothing, whatever. It's maybe a bad example, but it would harm the ability for other species to come in and colonize that habitat. And so that would be an example of a sort of amensalism. So we're going to switch back to the lecture notes. All right, so we defined the sort of symbioses. Most of the things sort of fall within this. And parasitism, I mean, that's just like a consumer resource interaction more generally. So we can also consider this as more predation, but typically symbiosis is doesn't consider predation, I don't think, in there. Because I guess they're not living together. The host-parasite relationship is very intimate relative to sort of predation. Although some people believe that parasites are micro-predators, and that's a whole thing that I'm not going to talk about in this class. And so now we'll switch into talk about, so this is what sort of the intro in terms of what ecology is. It is the interactions between shapes, i.e. species, via competition, via parasitism, via mutualism, via consumer resource interactions, but also interactions between species and their outside environment. These can occur, these species interactions bounded by this yellow bubble can occur interspecifically, meaning between species, or intraspecifically, meaning within a single species. All right, great. I'm going to go to another page. Now we have a brand new page to work from. And now I think we'll talk about what ecology isn't. And so I think a lot of people, when they think of ecology, they think of like World Wildlife Fund and recycling, and a lot of more things that are aligned with environmental science than with ecology. And so ecology is not environmentalism. I think I was talking to like my girlfriend's parents at the time, and they said, I said I was a PhD in ecology, and they said something like, oh, we recycle. And I remember thinking, cool. Nothing to do with that. So yeah, ecology is not environmentalism. Either the advocacy side of it or the just the sort of recycling and human impact lessening side of things. Ecology is not biomedicine. Biomedicine being the application of biology to create treatments for different medical ailments. Related to that, and so I think I'm taking this weird medicine and epi and health route because I think a lot of you are maybe pre-med and are thinking about this in maybe that lens. And so ecology is not the same thing as epidemiology, which is odd for me to say because I'm a disease ecologist, have taken courses from epidemiologists and know all of their models, right? I got funding to study like pathogen spread and like the classic epidemiological models of the SEIR and SIR models, which we'll learn about, I think, if Dajian keeps that in a later lecture. But epidemiology is simply the study of infectious disease, largely, if not entirely, focused on human disease and focused largely, if not entirely, on mitigation and control rather than understanding the sort of nuance or other factors that go into it. So things like what temperature influences the biting rate of a vector is not something that's in epidemiology, but is something that would be considered disease ecology and can have outcomes in terms of influencing the number of cases of infectious disease, as we've seen dengue and things like that, that tend to be climatically forced, meaning climate really influences something about the disease. And then there's two more, ecology, and this one is maybe a hot take on my part. I say ecology is not natural history. So many people, like there's been amazing natural historians that go out and document species diversity and they describe organisms. In my mind, this is not ecology. It doesn't follow the sort of scientific process that leads you to inference. It's not generalizable. So I would argue that natural history is not what we're going to be talking about, and not how we will define ecology in this course. And lastly, which is another hot take on my part, and Daijang and other people might take pause with this. I don't think they will. But evolution is, there's plenty of overlap between ecology and evolution. There's entire fields that basically look at what they call eco-evolutionary dynamics. However, despite it being closely related, evolution is not ecology. And I think that's why sort of when you hear a department being described as ecology and evolutionary biology, they keep those a little bit separate. So we actually won't talk about evolution, I don't think at all, in this course, unless Daijang changes that, which he might. But yeah, it's a thing. It exists. We can see it, but we're going to focus on ecological interactions. So now we'll talk about the different levels of biological organization. So this is how people think about biological structure. And so I'll hop back over to this page. And now we have a nice blank page. And so the first level of biological organization that we'll consider, and so there's much sort of finer scales that you can get to, especially considering things like protein-protein interactions and all that cool stuff. But we will not focus on that. We will say the lowest level of organization that we will consider in this class to be the individual. I attempted a 1. And individuals can vary in things like their height, their weight, their age, their likelihood to disperse, their likelihood to become infected by something, their likelihood of eating, right? So it's that individual variation that actually can be really important to understanding aggregate properties of the second step or stage or level, sorry, of biological organization. I'm going to switch back to black, which is the population. And so I'm keeping these in black for a reason. These are presumed to be things of the same species. They may look like crudely drawn stick figures, but I am an ecologist, not an artist. Sorry. And so we're going to draw a circle around here and accidentally cut off that guy's head a little bit. We're going to redraw that circle around here and make it more oblong. And we're going to call this 2. And so 1 is individual, 2 is population. I'll draw out pop and then switch colors and draw individual. And this is, I think we'll actually start at the population scale, and then we'll actually go to the individual scale to start looking at how we can get at like uncertainty and individual variation. Because starting at population is actually simpler, but you'll see why as we move forward. So let's say that we also have, I don't know what thing I can draw better, not better than a human. But let's say we have this thing. And this is a separate species. And then we also have this thing. And so now we have 3 species, and we have the next level of biological organization. And so we'll write 3. And this is the level of organization of the community. So community consists of multiple interacting species at a given bounded, somehow, geographic place. Right, and so that's important that these species have to interact. If they don't interact, then it's what's called an assemblage, typically. That may be splitting hairs. We will go over how that may be not splitting hairs when we talk about communities later in the semester. How do I get an agri-ecosystem and biome? All right, this is harder, right? This is where my research is right here. This is what I like. And now we're gonna go a little bit beyond it and start talking about different other levels of organization. And it's hard to actually draw what I would, okay, so then let's say we have, okay. Now I'm trying to draw in some like landscape features. And so here I'm drawing in a river. And then I'm just gonna, around here in yellow, which hopefully you can see, say things like pH, nitrogen, phosphorus. And so this is a horribly coarse and arguably laughable description of that fourth level of organization, which is the ecosystem. And so the community, ooh, I'm gonna write this out with a mouse. This is actually hard. All right. With the community, you have species interactions still among themselves. You're kind of ignoring the sort of biochemical processes that are going on in the background. When you look at the ecosystem scale, you're paying special attention to those processes. You're considering the role of the environment and the feedback between the environment and the species themselves. And so here we define an ecosystem as a community of living organisms and their interrelated physical and chemical environment. So that being the most important part of that. Should I try to even draw the biome or biosphere? I don't think I should, because it gets a little hard. It strains my abilities. I feel like I've filled the page. So imagine if we had multiple ecosystems, right? So we have a river ecosystem here. All of these things live in the river. And then we, over here, have mountain ecosystem, right? And so these are different sets. There are different communities of species that may live over here versus over here. Is that a good example? No, it's actually not that good of an example of biome. So a biome, yeah, biome still like considers, like a river biome might be a thing, even then. So many people have defined biome in different ways. And a lot of times you'll hear domain and ecoregion being thrown around. I guess just know sort of this definition of biome and then think about it. So I'm going to define biome by example, and hopefully that'll be okay. If we think about bayous or swamps or wetlands in the Southeast United States, there are many different types, right? And so there's like depression wetlands with a sandy bottom. There's like swamps, which are a little muckier, a little bit different properties going on there. I would still we can like broad brush it and just say that wetlands are a biome, meaning they're distinct ecological communities of plants and animals living together in a particular, what I call climate. But here, it's not really climate. It's a particular like place or that has a set of conditions. And so a swamp has some set of conditions. Other people will define biome just by climate. And so you'll see like, if you Google like sort of, and we can talk about this on Thursday, if you see like biome map, you'll see that people have sort of divided biomes geographically and said, oh, this is the dry, deserty biome. Desert, I guess, is a biome. I don't know. Desert's just so varied. Versus this is like the upland forest biome, and this is the ocean biome. It's not a biome. Is it? I don't know. See, and I guess it's important to note here that these sort of levels of complexity or biological organization, not complexity, are a little bit wiggly when you get, I feel like, past the ecosystem level. Except biosphere, because biosphere is a sort of absolute one. And that's it. It is all organisms and the part of Earth where they exist. It's just all of Earth. Just draw a big circle around the entire Earth. That's the biosphere. You got it. So yeah, I apologize. I think I was clear up until about here, and then I got stumbled across biome. And that's just because biome is super duper ambiguous to define. But how you can define it is if you can think about it and say, like, that's not an ecosystem. I forgot the S, I'll fix that. It's not an ecosystem because it's more broad than that. Because ecosystem is still, there's species directly interacting. And so if it's at a large enough scale where like those species, there could actually be different communities that exist there, like a series of pond habitats might not be occupied by the same species or communities, that would probably be best described as a biome. All right. Sorry, I'm scrolling through this to remind myself. And so in this section, I go a little bit about like human impacts, because I think a lot of us tend to sort of like selfishly look at systems through our own light. Like, what is my environment doing for me? What am I doing to my environment? And it might be helpful to sort of think about how these different levels of organization are influencing, are having different impact, how we as humans are impacting the different levels of biological organization, if nothing else, as to help solidify these concepts, and also introduce some new language. And so here I introduce the difference between a biotic versus an abiotic variable. And so biotic variable is anything that refers to a living thing. And so like me, I'm biotic. Biotic variable would be like a standing plant biomass. It's biotic, it's a living thing. Abiotic refers to something non-living. And so nitrogen concentration, that is an abiotic factor. pH, abiotic. Predator density, biotic. So that's an important distinction that I just decided to make right here. Okay, let's go through them. We'll go through these quickly because I don't want to take up too much of your time. I'm trying to mash this all into sort of one lecture and then allow Thursday for like more open discussion and try to get us all on the same page. And so here I sort of outline at the individual level how human-induced changes can alter landscapes and individual behavior. And so things like increasing dispersal of individuals is a thing. Like if you come in and change the land, you inherently are going to scare something off. Individual behavior can be altered by human-induced land changes. And so I give an example of hummingbird-plant interactions and with noise pollution at the individual level. Otherwise, this would be more community level. And then I also give an example of individual social behavior being modified by food supplementation. It'd be something that would modify the individual, but also have consequences at the population level, right? And so if you modify my social behavior, that's my social behavior and my interaction with other individuals of my same, within population, of my same species, so intraspecific interactions. The population scale changes. Let's see what I talk about. Yeah, direct or altered mortality or survival. And so that's something that sort of acts at the individual level. And so things like hunting, if I go out and shoot or kill a number of deer, I'm inherently reducing the population size directly of that organism, whether that's for the good or the bad, like that's irrespective. I'm just saying, like, you go out and you remove individuals from a population, you're having a direct effect on the population. Here I also go, I'd say that's more, I see now I'm like, oh, it's populations of algae. All right. So here's the muddy area. Here I'm saying human nutrient pollution from agricultural runoff that's really high in like nitrogen and phosphorus and resources for algae can cause algal populations to have increased growth rates. So arguably that also alters the ecosystem dynamics because it's the interaction of the algae with their environment, but their environment is also sort of like the nutrient pollution is like a resource. So that one actually goes sort of across 2 levels. I promise after this lecture, things will get much more concrete. This is like the Lucy hand wavy lecture, and then this next lecture is going to be like, here's single species population dynamics, and it's going to be much more fun and clear. I talk about community dynamics. If you have species that are differentially susceptible to a modified landscape, so if I come in and I chop down a bunch of trees, it's not going to affect all the species in the community equally. It might cause some bird to fly really far away, whereas the other bird is like, I'm okay with this. This is fine. And so that will change community composition, or the identities of the species that are present in a given place. Ecosystems changed by humans altering biogeochemical cycles. So things like when we figured out how to make fertilizer, that was crazy. How we could isolate nitrogen and mash it into fertilizer. That was not a good idea, or it was a great idea, depending on who you talk to. But it definitely messes up the global nitrogen cycle, arguably, which is an ecosystem level phenomenon. Yeah, so biome is when it starts to get a little fuzzy again. And so nobody studies entire biomes. Is that true? Most people don't study entire biomes. But I argue here that human-induced land use change can vary in its effect or severity as a function of like space or latitude. So when we start thinking about large-scale patterns, when we think about things like climate change is going to have, or is continuing to have, disproportionate effects at different areas in the globe. And so the rate of change, yeah, that's what I say in this one. The rate of change in temperature and precipitation is related to latitude, meaning poleward areas tend to experience worse and more rapid changes in climate, increasing temperatures and altered precipitation regimes. And then the biosphere, it seems like a sort of throwaway. How are we changing Earth? We're doing a lot. And I actually like, this is the sort of most like environmental sciencey that this class will get, I think. And so there's a big garbage patch that's around 100 or 1.6 million kilometers square of just plastic debris off the coast of California. So that's fun. Let's Google that. It's good stuff. All right, so now enough about how sort of like humans are altering these ecological interactions of different scales of biological organization. For the last little bit, I want to talk about how we do the science of ecology. And so I think many of you by now will be familiar with the term hypothesis, which is sort of like your idea about how the system works in a sort of colloquial sense. In a more direct or a well-defined sense, this is a falsifiable statement concerning how the system works. And that's the definition of a biological hypothesis. So it's not just an idea of how something works, but a clear statement with like a sort of putative cause. But that gets into some sketchy ecological fallacy type things, which if you don't know what that is, Google that and then realize that it has nothing to do with ecology. It's basically trying to infer causality from correlational data. Which I mean, like, we're guilty of. So it's a bunch of other fields, so I can't blame that one on us. Here I lay out some things as I think defined by Karl Popper here, largely from his view of what makes a good hypothesis, and maybe with my own sort of interpretations meshed in. And first, it has to be testable. So the concepts need to be able to be operationalized, and you have to be able to quantify it. Most of ecology and most of science is about counting. If I can't count or measure something, I can't really have a hypothesis about it. It has to be general. And so it doesn't really have to be, but it helps if it's general. So you can't say something about this specific geographic area and have it be a meaningful hypothesis because there's no way you can extrapolate beyond that area. And so it becomes very hard to apply in a general sense. So what's the point of that? So a hypothesis should be, if it's a good one, it should be generalizable. It needs to be falsifiable. And so this is definitely like going with the Karl Popper version of things. And so it has to be something that can be demonstrated to be untrue. Otherwise, it's just a sort of self-fulfilling idea, and that's not what it should be. And then finally, it shouldn't defy what we know logically, and so it should be plausible. So I want to study, like, my hypothesis is that unicorns can fly over 100 miles an hour. It's not testable. It's sort of general, but not really that general. I'm saying all unicorns. It's not really falsifiable, and it's not plausible. So that's not a good hypothesis. But let's say we have a hypothesis that's not so outlandish. And how do we go about actually doing the science once we have our idea about how a system works? Once we have that hypothesis, how do we actually test it? Ecologists test it through, I think I go over 4 different ways. I think I lump them. We test it by observations. So you go out in the field and you look at something and you take notes and you count. So you go in the field and you say, there are 10 plants of this species here. There are only 5 plants of that species over there. That's an observation. Yeah. And I give an example from macroecology, which we'll go over what that is later in the semester. But basically, that's a good example of something that's observational. So somebody named Bergman, I forget what his first name was. I think he did it in marine organisms first. He went out and said, individuals of the same species, so across their range, their geographic range, they had larger body sizes as they moved away from the equator. And he's like, why was that? But it's observational. So he went out and looked at a bunch of species across their ranges and took notes on how big they were, how much they weighed, or what their body length was, or something like that. And then we'll go over sort of the questions and try to get you guys to interact, you folks to interact in the Thursday class. So I'll sort of rehash some of this as well. The second way, apart from observations, would be field experiments. These differ from observations in that I'm actually manipulating the environment somehow. And so you can think about, if I wanted to look at the effects of herbivory, so eating of plants, so consumer resource interactions on the resulting plant community, I might set up a fence, right? Because here, over here, this is a plot where the consumers are able to eat all they want. But honestly, like, what's the effect of the consumers? And so I'm just going to build an exclosure. I'm going to build a fence to keep the consumers out. And now I have my experiment. I have my 2 groups. And my hypothesis would be that the standing plant biomass or the community composition or something will not be different between those 2 groups, with the idea that there probably will be a difference. But that's sort of the difference between a biological hypothesis and a statistical hypothesis, which we will not go into unless we maybe go into it on Thursday. We'll see. Third will be, the third approach are laboratory experiments. And so these fall under the idea of like a microcosm experiment or something like that. And the great thing about laboratory experiments is that you're bringing in the organism of study into the lab where you have a very controlled environment. And so all of the natural variation in temperature, and precipitation, and spatial processes, and blah, 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 you now have control over. So you can push things beyond what you'd see in nature. Like, let's say, I want to test if a mouse can survive at 150 degrees. It's never going to be 150 degrees outside. And so bringing that organism indoors and testing it in a laboratory experiment allows you to test that hypothesis. Also, I'm not advocating that you put a mouse at 150 degrees. That seems like a bad idea. And we won't talk about like the ethics of research here, but it's pretty unethical, so don't do that. And then is ecological modeling. And so we have from observations to field experiments to laboratory experiments, to the ecological model. And the ecological model is a description, a mathematical description about how a system behaves. So I think the examples, I give one example, I give the SIR model. It's actually, I just give it an SI model. And so this is a model used to track infectious disease progression. So S is the number of susceptible individuals in a population, and I is the number of infected individuals in the population. And so let's say I want to make this generalizable. So because I could be looking at any disease. I could be looking at COVID. I could be looking at the flu. I could be looking at chickenpox or measles or any mumps. That's always a one that comes up. I think we had some cases here in Louisiana not too recently, or not too long ago. So here it's a mathematical description of a system here where the number of susceptibles at time t plus 1, which is one time step in the future, is equal to the birth rate of susceptible individuals the birth rate times the number of susceptible individuals at time t. So how many new susceptible individuals are coming into the mix, minus the transmission of the pathogen as a function of, or multiplied by, the density of susceptible individuals and the density of infected individuals. And so this is like saying if you had a 5% chance of getting infected, given the total density of susceptible and infected individuals, there you go. That's transmission. And this just feeds into the infected class. And so the number of infected individuals that you have at time t plus 1 is equal to that bit. So that transmission rate times your susceptibles times your infecteds minus some recovery. So gamma, this is gamma, that's gamma, times I. And so recovered individuals just leave the class and go live their happy lives, and they don't go back into susceptible in this model. But there's a good reason why you might include them working back into susceptible, because many diseases, once you get infected, you don't have immunity. And so you go back to being susceptible. That was a sort of long dive into the ecological modeling, but suffice it to say that those are the sort of 4 main ways that we'll think about how we do ecology and maybe science in general as well. So if we have our field experiments, we have our observations, we have ecological models, and we have laboratory experiments. I said them slightly out of order, but we'll talk about them more on Thursday. Hope this was informative, and I will see you guys in the next video. Stop share. Nice, take care.